One for the Tax Increment Financing Study and Formulating Committee meeting, and today's February 8th. The first two items on our agenda are the December 7 meeting minutes and the January 23rd meeting minutes. And before we hear the update on these, I want to remind anybody who's watching that everybody on this committee is volunteer and trying to do other things. And we appreciate everybody's involvement, but with that, Mr. Warren, what's the status on the minutes?
You may have to fire me and get you a new secretary. I'm behind.
It's okay.
I almost finished the minutes of the last meeting, but I didn't quite get them done in time to post them today. I have not gone back and looked at the December 7 meeting, but I will commit to do both of those in today's minutes with the meeting on February 22nd.
Okay, so I understand everybody's volunteering. The only thing that is concerning me a little bit is we close in on the March 6th public hearing. I want to make sure that we've got the minutes up in plenty of time for that.
I'll have them up at the February 22nd meeting.
All right.
You could quit.
I could. I was afraid Bob was going to fire me. Didn't happen.
You're going to have to try harder than that to get fired. All right, so items 1 and 2 are going to be held in abeyance, pending getting the minutes done, which will definitely be by the next meeting. And then item number 3 is one of 2 discussions we're going to have today. And this one is, what are the current and potential impacts of tax increment financing on affordable housing? And today we've got a panel of 3 folks, Michael Kenner, Eddie Latimer, and Hunter Nelson. And I guess I know I shared with you guys by email, but just to underscore briefly, so we've now had 15 hours of meetings and tons of materials online, and we've got a good sense of the mechanics of tax increment financing. The one thing that we're trying to be careful about in our conversations is it's really easy, especially when we get to affordable housing, to get to alphabet soup. And so we're going to ask you guys to be careful, especially for the viewing audience, to be careful with LIHTCs and AMIs and the rest of it all. So with that, what I'd like to do is, before getting to the tax increment financing part, is have each of you talk about what it is that your organization does in relation to affordable housing. Then we can get to tax increment financing. And I guess I'd like to start with Michael, and then move to Eddie, and then Hunter.
My name is Michael Kenner. I own Mike in Development. We are a for-profit, mission-oriented development company that specializes in what is called neighborhood-centric development. So we focus on one neighborhood at a time and try to develop the missing middle. Mike essentially tries to do, by mission-oriented, I mean we try to do at least 10% of every development that we do is affordable housing. That's something that we either use city subsidies for or partner with the Housing Fund, which is a community development and financial institution here in town. And then I also have helped write state policy specifically regarding the HIP program for Nashville. And then when it got implemented here, helped on a little bit of that at the beginning. So
let me just ask, you said missing middle. Maybe you can describe for a second what missing middle means?
So most of the time when developers go into a neighborhood like Salem Town or the Nations, for instance, they build all 3-bedroom, 2 baths that are all 2,000 square feet. And it's kind of the same product, and they sell them for $400,000 a piece. And there's kind of socioeconomic sterilization that happens when that happens. And so what we try to do is go in and build a diversity of product ranges from 350 square feet all the way up to 1,600 square feet, and create price points that were previously unattainable within that neighborhood just by reducing our size. What we found is that they are affordable at point of sale, but normally they do not stay truly affordable unless you put real measures in place to maintain affordability.
Okay. And I guess one other thing I should have mentioned, we're all real close at this table, so it's easy to be conversational. And just remember, there's folks around us and from the public that just to speak up a little bit. And then I guess last question before we move on to the rest of the introductions. Can you give a couple of examples just so people know where your projects are and maybe have driven by them?
There's a building I own called the Phoenix. It's on 51st Avenue. It's got a butcher shop in it and a brewery. A great butcher shop, great chili. And then I've got a 20-acre master plan community. It's right around the corner from that. That's 350 units and 10,000 square feet of retail. It's called the Annex. And then I've got an 82-unit development called Treaty Oaks that's also in the Nations. And then I've developed about 120 units total in Salem Town, including Salem Town Cottages. And one of those units within Salem Town Cottages was my first affordable deed-restricted unit that we had done with the partnership with New Level CDC. And that's kind of where I cut my teeth on it.
Great. Eddie?
All right, with Affordable Housing Resources, we're a 30-year-old nonprofit housing development agency. We're also a CDFI, which just means that we do lending. We're certified lenders, and we have several mortgage products that we use for help first-time buyers get in a home, like a first mortgage and a down payment loans. But as a developer, primarily what we've done is single-family, 3-bedroom, 2-bath homes. And then we got into the condos. We developed some stuff over by the farmers market, some townhomes and condos that were for sale. And then we used the TIF over at 5th and Main, and of a $46 million deal, it provided about $7 million. And it was a real critical 7. It was one of the, top 5 layered financing. I think there were like 11 layers, but they were one of the 5 critical layers.
Lawyer's dream.
Oh yeah, Bo Campbell loved us. So he did a good job. But it was, at that point in time when we were doing this, I think this was in the Purcell administration, it was just for housing. And it was pretty much run out of through Manning. He was the finance director of the city, and he pretty much oversaw it and he regulated it. And but it was a real critical piece in the sense of giving us some of that. We had bank loans for about over half of it, about 60% of that. I mean, I've got a pro forma if anybody wants to see it. And then we had new market tax credits, which funded all the commercial. We had a whole ground floor commercial. And then we had the TIF money helped us with the parking garage and the basic infrastructure of the building. And it wouldn't have happened without that piece. And I think TIF is a really critical tool for affordable housing, especially with this era where we have less and less and less sources of funding targeting affordability.
So there's about 7 follow-up questions I have from that, but we're going to take care of the last introduction, and then I'm going to come back to you.
I'm Hunter Nelson. I'm with an affordable housing developer here in town called Elmington Capital. We mainly do affordable housing at 60% AMI, unless our area median income, excuse me for already breaking the alphabet super rule. And we specifically use the low-income housing tax credit program and operate in many states. And then we have a sister company that is a management company that operates maybe 26,000 units in 11 states. Half of those are affordable in some form or fashion, either by federal, state, or local incentives.
All right. And I guess before I go back to Eddie, one thing that is just mind-boggling to the average person is the complexity of this topic. And just in the last 5 minutes, you've talked about, I think maybe it was a joke, maybe it wasn't, about 11 layers of financing for a project. And you mentioned a state/local program, tax increment financing, and you mentioned a federal program, new market tax credits, and you mentioned a different federal benefit administered by the states, which is low-income housing tax credits, and they're all different programs. And I guess so it's normal that when you're doing an affordable housing project, you're having multiple layers of finance. Not like when I buy a house and I just go to the bank, get a loan. What's the average that you've experienced as far as sources of financing to make affordable housing work?
Well, it's always is never more than, there's never less than 3.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's probably 11 is probably on the high end. I think our highest is probably 9 in Connecticut on a deal, but it's never less than 3.
How about you, Eddie?
I think 3 is the smallest, and I think that, and then we did these townhomes, some of y'all are familiar with. We did Scott Avenue, which is over in East Nashville, which was, all the buildings were destroyed in the tornado, so we worked with the city to redo that. We did, with MDHA, we did row 8.9, and we did Ireland Street, and I think each one of those had, one had 8, one had 9 levels of financing. And that doesn't even include the fact that MDHA got us the land. I mean, that's, you know, they were the ones that provided the land, and that's not even in that stack of financing.
All right. How about you, Mike?
Just on a single-family house, it's done through the Barnes Fund program. We have an average of 5 to 7, depending on the buyer. We have a down payment assistance grant that was given to us by Wells Fargo that's administered through New Level. We have Barnes Fund funding. We have traditional bank financing. And then we just sit down with Vivian Wilhoit and Representative John Ray Clemens to pass state legislation to lower the taxes on these Barnes Fund units so that they're not taxed at market rate, which is something that might end up helping with LIHTC stuff too down the road. But so we find as many inventive ways as we can, let me put it that way.
All right. Then let me get back to a bunch of the stuff that you mentioned. You mentioned, Eddie, that back during the Purcell administration, TIF was just for housing. And so I'm going to blend in some stuff that we've worked on through this group. Mr. Warren is experienced with state laws on it, and one of the memos we've got on our SharePoint drive for the public to see is detailed description about how TIF money absolutely positively cannot be used under state law for affordable housing, but it can be used for land and certain infrastructure costs. And one of the great confusions I think we've seen is that people think you can use TIF for affordable housing, and you just said it. But would you agree that the more precise point is that it can't be used for the sticks and bricks and building a bathroom, building a bedroom, but it can be used for land and infrastructure related to an affordable housing project?
Yeah, it's a little bit, works a little bit more like CDBG. I mean, I don't know if you know, CDBG is sort of like dirt and under, and home money is dirt and above. This is real simplistic, okay? Right. And so, would you agree, Joe?
You agree on the simplistic part.
But so, and I see it sort of like it functions in our mind as CDBG, which is a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the stuff to get the thing going. It could go either way. It could be affordable or not, but there was a priority.
Yeah, and what I guess I've understood the point is that during the Purcell administration, I don't know whether there's a 100% rule, maybe you've got the recollection of it, but that if a project didn't have affordable housing in it, it wouldn't get TIF during those years?
Well, I don't recall that.
I actually had a client who had a TIF proposal during the Purcell administration to build a hotel. Unfortunately, the Purcell administration spanned 9/11, and after 9/11 happened, nobody was going to build a hotel anytime soon, so we didn't take advantage of the TIF. There was one.
I guess I know Mr. Kenner and I have had multiple conversations over, I guess, a year and a half now about whether TIF can be used for affordable housing, should be used for affordable housing, or not. And I guess let's jump into that part of it. What's your take on that, Mr. Kenner?
So TIF administered by MDHA and through that avenue is technically not allowed to go to sticks and bricks, but TIF administered through the Industrial Development Board is allowed to go to affordable housing for sticks and bricks from what I understand. And one of the advantages of the Industrial Development Board is that you can do it on a parcel by parcel basis. You don't create these these districts that become archaic within, 5 years that stick around for 30. And so it's kind of a more flexible way, from what I understand, to administer TIF, and it's actually how Chattanooga does their TIF policies. And a significant amount of it has to go to create job growth. But, if you look at the latest TIF that Chattanooga just did, where they extended MLK, it wasn't like they extended it and built an industrial park. They extended it into a residential community that had a small amount of retail, and that's actually done by a local developer, Evergreen out of Nashville, and that's their Camden Harbor deal down there. But Chattanooga has just recently used TIF for a road extension into a residential community. So I think that you can use TIF and infrastructure through many different avenues. If we really want to say there's a lot of tools in the toolbox, then if our TIF toolbox could be 3 different revenues of TIF instead of funneling it all through one administrative board, and we had flexibility to be able to do TIF in different areas outside of TIF districts per se, I think that would allow us to have a lot more tools in the toolbox, which is what we were trying to garner to create affordable housing.
So let me, I know you're not part of the panel, Mr. Warren, but the description about that Mr. Kenner just gave about IDB TIF being parcel by parcel and could be used for affordable housing as long as it's got a jobs component, is that right?
I'm not as familiar with the IDB TIFs. We have not used them very much in Davidson County. I'm mostly familiar with the ones that MDHA does, and I think it's as you described earlier in terms of what you can use it for. I think there are some broader uses, and it is parcel by parcel.
Did any of the other panelists know about we had a long discussion with the MDHA TIF, like what you can use it for, what you can't use it for, and I guess I just don't know on IDB what you can and can't use it for.
I can't say that I know what you can or cannot use it for, but IDB did have TIF out at Bellevue, and I do think that was approved parcel by parcel. We recently had to bring an amendment to the council to get some of those parcel outlines kind of reestablished. So the IDB is doing that.
All right.
She's a question.
Yes, go ahead.
The point that you were making is that the IDB TIFs can be used outside the development districts?
Yes. So I can come in on a project-by-project basis and apply in Chattanooga through the mayor's office. And it's ultimately up to the mayor to say, yes, we will take this in front of the IDB. And then the IDB says, okay, well, we'll create a TIF for the specific parcel, and it only encompasses your parcel, and then you have it prearranged on the front end, the exact pay schedule of how that works for the tax assessor's office as well, so you're not taxing an entire district, it's taxed parcel by parcel, which would alleviate some of the problems I think that some people had with the Donaldson TIF, and some of the reasons why it wasn't successful. And like I said, I think it allows for some flexibility that we just don't have with MDHA's current TIF program.
And I just refreshed my recollection of looking at my memo. IDB TIFs can be used for projects, and projects does include low to moderate income, elderly or handicapped multifamily housing. So it's got a broader definition than the TIFs that MDHA administers.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So, question, so, and maybe this is just my experience, but from a TIF use perspective, when you add land and infrastructure and all of the different things that it can be used for, do you ever run into a situation where you've got, that you run out of those categories when you're looking at TIF? So in other words, if TIF is, $7 million in that case, if you looked at the land acquisition, infrastructure, water, sewer, all that, all of those were qualifying expenses. Is it a semantics game that we're talking about, that it can't be used for affordable housing, or is it really when you get to the infrastructure piece?
Well, I was wondering about that with Eddie because the $7 million out of $46 million, I'm going to guess that his answer has a lot to do with the parking that got built to get that to be qualifying. But I was wondering that same question of what went into the $7 million, and Bert is asking the question you know, are you, to what extent is gamesmanship happening to squeeze into the definition?
I really hate to tell you this, Bob, but I don't remember. I just didn't pull out the files and study it at that level, but I could get that information for the committee, and I'll be glad to do that. We had a lot of expense in that basement. We discovered that part of Main Street was built on a dump. Do you remember all this? It was built on a dump. It was about 40 feet deep, and Main Street started to cave in, and so that was a lot bigger expense than we expected, and it consumed that. And I think that Fannie money, it consumed some change getting that fixed.
And I guess, Mr. Kane, like, I'm under the impression that MDHA is actually engaging and figuring out whether it's a qualifying expense or not.
Absolutely. He had there were public streets that were put in as part of that. All the utilities were extended into the public streets, those roads that run into that. It was also developed as a multi-phased project. When you were still participating in it, they had actually only completed the first phase. The other phases have now come online with that. And so the infrastructure and the upfront costs actually went to a larger overall project, but it got eaten up on the front end with the cost, land costs, and then the site costs. You had demolition costs in there. That was the old
The warehouse.
the old warehouse building that was sitting on there as well. And the total site was probably pushing, what, 6 acres?
Yeah, and we did the infrastructure for all 3 phases.
Yeah, and so it was a multi-phase project, and the TIF went in to develop a multi-phase project. His project got completed right at the time the recession was starting to hit in there, and so the other phases were later coming on board with the project on there. But so your part of it kind of ended at that 46 million, but now we have, with the other buildings sitting on there, it has increased in scope and size.
And then to follow up on that is, I'm under the impression that it's definitely happened where a developer has said, these are the things we'd like pay for, and you guys look at the list and say, yes, no, not that one.
We go through the list and compare it all to the eligible expenses under state statute. And then we require the invoices coming into us that are identifying that from the contractor, the pay apps that are actually coming in, because we don't release the funds until the work's been completed. And so we are checking those off as the project is done to ensure that the actual infrastructure is going in. The land does get, the funds for the acquisition get released at the time of the real estate closing, because that expense is taking place. But if you are putting in the infrastructure, those funds get released as the construction is taking place.
And if I recall, the South they loaned us $7 million off the TIF loan, and they were involved. I mean, they oversaw it too, because they had some liability, making sure all the money was spent within the regulations. So you have some really good oversight to make sure how it's used, and it's used right, just that are naturally built in there.
Okay, thanks. That answers the question.
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about affordable housing, having TIF as a part of all the different levels that are in there, it's kind of calling 2 different things.
Yeah. Let me switch, Hunter. I know your company big. You've done projects in a lot of places. Is there anything about how tax increment financing works or is available or is decided here in Nashville that you all wish were different or you think could be better?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the situations they're talking about, TIF, it was generally all for sale product, right? On the rental side, the way that the state dictates that affordable housing properties are assessed, TIF isn't as useful of a tool as pilot, mainly just because the pilot locks in your assessment rate today, and that's what we do with Joe and MDHA, versus the way the state dictates to Nashville how affordable housing rental properties are assessed. The TIF isn't as beneficial per se, because you end up through the first, and Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, the first 10 years of ownership, you were paying through the nose on property taxes relative to the value of the property and your rents, and so it's not as beneficial the TIF is versus a pilot, which is essentially a TIF by another name, but it locks in the assessment which at today's value, which is more beneficial for rental properties than a TIF would be.
Clarify that for you.
Absolutely.
So you get appraised on market value for what that piece of, that apartment is?
Yeah, so if you think about it from a way affordable rental property would work, let's say it cost me $20 million to build the property, but because I've taken tax credits and have agreed through a deed restriction to lower my rent, it may only be worth $10 million, right? It's a way affordable rental property works. It's just not worth as much as it costs to on a market value. It's not worth as much as it costs to build. But what the assessor then comes in is he says, okay, that's the market rate of your income stream, like a way a market appraisal works. But I'm also going to add in the amount of tax credits that you've gotten from the federal government too. So to put in dollars and cents, we own 66 units in Bordeaux off Clarksville Pike. Our average rents up there are maybe $800 a month, and for a while we paid $2,300 a unit a year in taxes. So a third of the year we went to collect money just to pay Davidson County for the benefit of being in Davidson County.
And this is a Tennessee,
It's a Tennessee
but it's
issue.
only Tennessee, isn't it?
Only in Tennessee.
And we're the only state that actually.
There's a few other states that do it, but Tennessee was one of the first. It came out of a court case where Spring Hill assessed a developer. The developer sued Spring Hill and made it all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the ruling against the developer, and now it's case law. And the assessor now dictates down to each individual county that this is the way we assess property in the state. And so it's essentially the first 10 years of ownership. It's a 10-year issue because that's when the credits are.
That's for LIHTC.
Yeah, for LIHTC. Yeah.
Tax LIHTC.
Yeah, the tax credits are on the property for 10 years. So for the first 10 years, you fight the assessor every year to reduce the value of your credits. So.
Eddie, this is an issue you guys run into also? No?
No, that's just a LIHTC issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's a LIHTC issue, but it's the reason because during those first 10 years, your taxes are higher.
Just so LIHTC, low-income housing tax
That's right.
credit, it's a federal program administered by a state agency that gives out credits to qualifying
That's right.
projects.
That's right.
Most of those properties are 100%
Affordable.
of that
Affordable.
range.
So a TIF, because you're taking the stream of your tax payments and leveraging those over 15 years, whatever the term is, that additional tax that you pay on the tax of the tax credits, just you're moving money that you could leverage over 30 years, which would be more money you're only putting in 10 years to be paid back. So the TIF wouldn't produce as much money as, say, a pilot would.
That's also done through the IDB.
A pilot, sorry, a payment in lieu of taxes. I'm sorry, payment in lieu of taxes.
And Joe, can you just describe for everybody who's watching how a pilot works?
A pilot in Davidson County must have low-income housing tax credits on that. And so after a project receives low-income housing tax credits, they would make an application to MDHA for a pilot. We review the pro forma, no different than THTA does, to determine what the project is capable of paying in property taxes, which is essentially doing an income approach on the property as if the rents are restricted. And that's the difference between what the tax assessor does versus what we do. It's as if the rents were restricted. So the income to that property is substantially less than what a fair market, a free market apartment would have. Those pilots then, agreements go through our approval process through committee and the board, and then goes to Metro Council by resolution for authorization of the approval of the pilot. And then the documents are executed, leases are executed. For the property to become tax exempt, it actually transfers ownership over to MDHA, which is a tax exempt entity, and then the developer makes a payment in lieu of property taxes that goes to Metro government.
Yeah, I'll add briefly. So pilots are viewed as Metro giving up revenue, but what I'm hearing you say is the payment gets set at what the property taxes would be if you did the valuation based on the actual income as opposed to what you could sell the property for if it was all market rate.
Yes, and there is a pre-qualification in there that the pilot payment must be higher than the existing property taxes coming to the county. So there is no loss of tax revenue coming into the city because the base threshold is set at the prior to what the new affordable housing would be.
And I'm not sure you'll know the exact number, but the pilot program's been in place for barely 3 years.
Yes.
And what's the total number of units approximately, do you think, where affordability has been preserved with the pilot program?
Preservation is probably pushing 1,000 plus units. And we have done new construction, which has not necessarily come online yet, probably pushing about the same number of units on there. I believe we only have 2 pilots that are officially online and have reached full occupancy prior to during the 2018 tax year.
Was the Stallman also a pilot, but through IDB?
No, the pilot, we did a pilot on spaghetti vector.
And you had the same issue there, kind of the same thing we would face where you had, then they taxed the leasehold interest.
Oh, and we didn't draft it correctly.
Yeah.
It was awful.
It's kind of the same situation that we would face, that you face, where they then tax the leasehold interest and sure.
Yeah, they taxed it at market, even though we had X number of units
Yeah.
that were less.
So let me ask you guys this. What could Metro do to help I mean, we've talked about this being a state issue about the assessment. What can Metro do to have tax increment financing, because that's the focus of this group, or around this taxation generally, help facilitate more affordable units?
Nashville has the shortest term of tax abatement specifically for affordable housing than every other major municipality in the state. So Memphis is 25 years, Knoxville's 20, and Chattanooga's 15, and Nashville sits at 10. So it's one thing. That's pretty easy.
In the pilot
In
program?
the pilot program.
Okay.
So it's by far the least. Secondly, a TIF doesn't take a council vote. It's in and of itself, which is political action. But TIF, it just goes straight to MDHA and the board. So in order to get a pilot, more or less, we have to convince a council member that they'll allow affordable housing development in their district in order to sponsor a resolution that then is approved.
And you just speak a little bit to that?
We've in the previous sessions, we've had open and honest discussions, so
Yeah, absolutely.
lay it on us.
I mean, we've had, yeah, forever. Words wisely, yeah. So we've done 3 in the city pilots. One in Old Hickory in Councilman Hager's district, who supported us and went along and was wonderful. One in Hermitage in Steve Glover's district, who went along and was great with us on supporting us. And then one in East Nashville with Councilman Davis, who supported us as well. But I mean, there are certain aspects of the city that I just know I couldn't go talk to a council member and they're going to say, yes, absolutely, we love affordable housing here, even though I may drive them and show them all the property I've built and how I am a good landowner and I build a good product and I promise it's not going to be an issue in your city. There are certain council districts who I know would love affordable housing. Take District 1 in the middle of the CBID. I'm sure we'd love to do that there, but the land is too expensive to buy it. So, but because of that, whereas take Memphis, for example, Memphis takes X number of dollars a year in pilot authority and grants it to the Health and Ed Board or some quasi-metro government, and it comes out with a program that says, if it fits within this box, your board's going to vote on it, and if you pass it, then the pilot's there. It kind of takes the political nature of where developers can and can't go out of the hands of Metro Council or the City Council in Memphis.
Now, say that again. The City Council of Memphis does what now?
They take, I think it's maybe $50 million a year in pilot authority and specifically for affordable housing, and grants that authority to the Memphis Health and Ed Board, who administers the pilot program, and then they have 3 times a year they have an open application process where they take applications for affordable housing, and if you more or less meet their guidelines and you go and you meet in front of their board and they approve you, then you have a pilot.
Is this a soft pitch for buy right development?
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, In North Carolina, if you're a nonprofit and you're putting a deed restriction on your property for affordable housing, or your project has a nonprofit general partner in it, you get a in perpetuity tax abatement. So until you decided not to be affordable housing at that time.
So one of the
I would
things.
love that.
One of the things that we've talked a lot about is, I mean, no surprise to you guys, whether it's warranted or unwarranted, one of the central gripes about tax increment financing is that it feels very opaque to the public. And so one of the things we've wrestled with is transparency versus the politics that you're mentioning. And, up till now, at least the pilot balance is, it's plenty transparent because it goes through MDHA, then it comes to the council and it's on agendas and there's meetings and so we clearly are checking the box on transparency, but you're identifying the politics issue. Any ideas about how we could handle the transparency?
Well, there's a couple other things too with that is, and Joe knows this, I can't go before Metro Council until I'm at the very end of my development. So I'm ready to close is when it goes to Metro Council. And so at that point in time, I've spent $1.5 million in pre-development cost, and I have to have this to make sure it works. So I have to kind of keep everybody happy that's supporting the program until we get to the end. And so there's a lot of financial risk that goes into whether or not you're actually going to get a central tenement of your development.
Why is that again?
I think it's just the way the program is. I have to have my final THCA sign-off, which are the tax credits, until we get to that point. But even if I have all the state and federal financing in place at that point, it's not until we go to MDHA's board and then to Metro Council for the resolution till we are done with the project.
Is that a requirement of city
I assume it's a
legislation?
requirement of the city. I'm not sure, but it's not to the very end that I've been able to get it. But at that point, the developer is kind of just out there on the end saying, gosh, I hope this passes,
How is it different in other Tennessee cities?
Oh, I can get it at the very beginning. I mean, I can go, I have
At least get the commitment.
yeah,
for
get
it.
the commitment. Yeah, and then I have, I have X amount of time to close on that authority. And if I want an extension, I then have to go and request an extension to that. But I'm given 6 months or 9 months to then close at that point in time before I, but with that authority in hand. So but here it's kind of backwards. You get everything else done, and then you ask for your pilot, and it hadn't happened yet. But imagine somebody had a pilot that they wanted to have done on a project. They have the local council member who's approved it, and then you have an election in August, and the man or woman who comes in after you doesn't like it. Then you may be SOL at that point. So.
We won't define that acronym.
Yeah.
That's not a house.
Yeah. Sorry, out of luck.
And this is all talking about pilot.
That's right. But it's the most widely used, tax increment financing vehicle in the city for affordable housing today. I mean, also too, way TIF is today, where it's on a redevelopment district basis. Those redevelopment districts, the land's just too expensive to buy to put affordable housing today. Or you get in a situation like Richard is on the Housing Fund Board, which is the only last affordable housing in the Gulch. It's 48 units at under 60% AMI, and we're struggling to keep the lights on because our tax bill is so high.
I couldn't believe how high it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Percentage of our revenue.
a huge percentage of the revenue is just going for taxes, and we're trying to maintain the last bit of affordable housing in the Gulch, and I'm the vice chairman of the board, so I can say we, but we're struggling to maintain profitability on the units just because the taxes are so high.
At what point in the process are you entertaining a conversation with the council
At
person?
the very beginning,
The very beginning?
before I start.
Before they start thinking about
When I-
zoning requests or
That's right.
anything?
I mean, well, usually, the way affordable housing works, and maybe Eddie can say this, but you're usually already going for a zoned piece of property because you want to go through that process, but you're going, that's a whole nother issue. That's right, yeah. But if you find a zoned piece of land from the very beginning, before I start putting plans in place or anything like that, I'm meeting with the council member saying, here, upfront and honest, I want to build affordable housing on this piece of property in your district. Tell me what you think. let me know what you
I
think.
was concerned about that because of this investment that you were making.
Yeah, I mean, it's at the very beginning, and you're hoping that, again, you don't want there to be an election cycle in between that period of time in case something happens. But at the very beginning, you are having that conversation on the front end. At least, both in every municipality, you're having that because you just don't want to run into any issues. But here, you're testing the waters at the very beginning.
I feel like we could talk about this for a long time, but I want to get from you guys whether there's something the city could do with TIF or pilot, I guess, property taxes to facilitate affordable housing more.
Okay, I know, 3 properties, they're 10 acres each. There's one of them that we're interested in. There's one of them that another nonprofit owns that will probably do multifamily. And there's a third one where about 5, y'all don't know that, there's 6 nonprofits in Nashville whose mission is to build housing. There are 20 nonprofits in Nashville that do housing to fulfill their mission to their clients. But the 6 are working together to try to develop. We've got an opportunity to do 10 acres. The thing that'll kill all of it is infrastructure. The land's in hand. It's just, it used to be back in '06, right before the crash, and it was real expensive. Man, you could have a lot, a classic 50 by 150 lot, for about $25,000 to $27,000, and now it's in the 40s. So, and a lot of that's infrastructure. So this TIF could be very valuable in that level, because the CDBG is going to continue to get hammered. And that used to be the money that made everything happen. But so TIF could really be valuable in the infrastructure and the development of the land.
Yeah, if anything, federal funds are going away for affordable housing. They're not increasing. They're on their way down.
And honestly, infrastructure is the biggest thing. It's sort of, all 3 conversations have gotten to that point, and it's sort of, everything's on the back burner.
You guys feel like TIF and pilot can coexist? They seem like they run at odds with one another.
No, I don't think you can. It's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same money.
Right.
Cancel each other out.
It seems like TIF works really well on the for sale piece. Pilot works better on a rental.
Or pilot doesn't work on if I'm doing 10% as affordable within my rental building, or maybe even 20% if I want to try and capture 80 to 100% of AMI, or maybe even 60 to 100%. The pilot wouldn't work for me for that.
That's right.
So you're 100%.
I guess I'm saying
at 60%.
Pilot works better with low-income housing tax credit properties, which is the main source of financing for affordable housing nationally on rental. TIF works better on terms of mixed income with maybe local incentives without that federal piece.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's probably the best way.
And the cool thing about the IDB regulations at the state level that I've read is that they have to have a public meeting. So they open it up for a public meeting. So it goes in front of the board, like MDHA, it gets opened up for a public hearing after that. And then it goes in front of council. And so there's 3 control measures if you kind of reroute the TIF in a different direction. And it's a lot more open and transparent that way because you actually have public input at the public hearing. And so you have to pitch your project not only to a board, but then to the general public and then through council.
And any other ideas on this line of what the city ought to be able to do with property taxes to make affordable housing easier?
I think that this legislation John Ray Clemens is working on will allow Vivian Wilhoit to apply the tax freeze for the elderly mechanism that's been in place and use that for affordable housing as well, I think is what it's trying to do. So once that legislation, if it gets passed, which hopefully it will, would allow her the freedom to be able to use that same instrument.
Yeah, and a lot on the rental side, there's always an exclusion for nonprofits if you own 100% of the property to be exempt from, if it's your mission-based, right, to be exempt from property taxes. It's a challenging thing.
It's an opportunity, but it's not a guarantee.
I know, it's not a guarantee.
Or whatever it is, I mean, do you not have a problem with that I guess not. Okay, never mind, I'm just...
Well, when we sell it, it's the owner that's the important thing. And I would add to what he said about seniors, you've got to get them, anybody living on SSI, homeless, disabled, special needs, A&D, all of those people that are stuck on that fixed income, they all need frozen taxes. especially in a city that's going to continue to grow and have an appetite for more money like this. It really needs to, they need to be able to have that part of their life, that the expense fixed.
The other thing is that the income and age and all those other limits apply across the board to the state. So if you're in some sub-rural county, you have the same income requirement as if you were in Nashville. So there's, and I think John Ray's proposed legislation addresses that.
Okay.
He's working on a formula with AARP.
Well, I can honestly say I think we could talk for another hour, but we've got other stuff on our agenda. So I've gotten through the questions I wanted to ask you guys. I feel like we just sort of scratched the surface today. Does anybody else have anything they want to ask these guys while we have them?
The one thing, if there are specific recommendations like you had, Hunter, that you think that we ought to be focusing on, just a email to Bob or whoever, and they can be simple descriptions that we can dive in, but advice would be wonderful.
Yeah, I took notes, but I would love if you could summarize if you had a wish list, what you're trying to, with the Metro can control, that would be great. And, as we get going through putting a report together, love to be able to send it to all three of you guys to get comments.
Well, we have a real life situation where a rental affordable deal couldn't pay its taxes with MDHA because of the tax issue with Ryman Loss, where, the tax bill was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars that had to be, worked out there, where the city's own housing authority couldn't make the tax payment to the city. So, it's not just an issue for, people in the private sector, on nonprofit and for-profit. It's an issue for the housing authority as well to figure out, and everyone else. So,
And same with the infrastructure issue. That's the biggest challenge at Casey is you got some substantial infrastructure and site costs there, just given where the location is and what you're coming from the other side of the interstate and from the river. That is the biggest challenge with what MDHA is trying to do. So obviously there's a lot of overlap in these issues as well.
absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, guys. You're welcome to stick around for the next.
I can't wait.
Thanks a lot.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, appreciate it. Charles Roberts, I see you.
Good to see you. Very good. Good to see you. Those cores. I appreciate it. Good to see you.
Hey, Bob, thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for your time. Thanks, Hunter. Good to see you.
I'm going to shift around the corner. What's that? Yeah. Thanks.
Four sources of funds down there, but they were just small nonprofits and down on the ground, about $5 million.
I was going to go to that thing with 6 o'clock some other way. I mean, when you're trying to look for $700-800.
Take care.
Hey, Brian.
You want this seat or you? Even up a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah, thank you. I'll do that real briefly. All right, so before we go to the next item on the agenda, which is a conversation about transparency that Brian and Charles Robert are going to talk about, I want to mention that we put in the SharePoint online the mayor's task force on transit and affordability recommendations from about a year ago, and pages 22 to 29 of this, which you can find online, had a report from the Affordability Subcommittee about how to deal with transit and affordability. And a lot of it had to do with tax increment financing. As we go through our report, I would like it if we at least were cognizant of the recommendations from a year ago. That was, the task force was led by former Mayor Purcell and Brenda Wynn, and there was a similar sort of effort in terms of time and energy and brain power that went into that report. And I know those that participated, including Paulette Coleman, and I would really like for that work not to be lost to time. Anyway, just wanted to mention that. And so we'll go ahead to you guys.
Yeah, so Brian and I met earlier this week to talk about this a little bit, and I think kind of how we broke down what we were going to put on the table was both transparency and information and transparency and process. And I give Brian credit for coining those. I'm not smart enough to come up with how it's divided. But I thought I would, I'm sorry?
Speak up.
So I thought what I would do is spend a little bit of that time just giving just a broad overview of MDHA, what MDHA is attempting to do to be more transparent, and then specifically a little bit about TIF, and then transition that into some of Brian's thoughts and ideas. I think it's important kind of for the viewing public to know, so MDHA is an 80-year-old organization created primarily by state law. MDHA serves about 13,500 families, both through housing voucher program and through housing units that now primarily MDHA owns. Some of those are owned by a few are still owned by the federal government, primarily by what MDHA owns. As evidenced by our work here, a lot of the energy and the attention gets focused on TIF. The reality is MDHA has 304 employees, or I'm looking at Joe, as of 30 days ago, had 304 employees. Only 5 of those employees have, including Joe, have much to do with redevelopment districts and TIF, and it's not, in those redevelopment districts, it's not just administering the TIF program, it's also design review and other things that come alongside that. So I think one of the big misunderstandings is that the vast majority of what MDHA does is housing. I think the other big misunderstanding is MDHA serves and answers to a lot of constituencies. You've got HUD, you've got THDA and the state government, then obviously you've got the city and the Metro Council. You've also got our employees, you've got those 13,500 residents, and then you've got, as was evidenced by the panel we had here, both kind of for-profit and nonprofit developers out there that have some overlap, some interaction with the MDHA, particularly in the housing space. MDHA gets no ongoing operating funds from the city. All of the operating funds come from the federal government and through HUD. We have from time to time gotten some assistance from a capital standpoint and from some other programs that we can help administer with the city. I'm not, as chair of MDHA, I'm not immune to, but am sensitive to the reputation that MDHA has from time to time, and particularly as it relates to transparency. We are trying our hand. Some of those have been ideas and requirements from others. Some of those we've tried to do ourselves. Specifically, some of the things that MDHA is committed to do is posting more detailed agendas online in advance of the meeting. Like any agency, department within Metro, obviously we have an agenda that is posted on the website and that goes out to those who subscribe it, but we're committed to now putting out a much more detailed agenda. Obviously, there had not been a requirement in the past that beyond the initial disclosures when a board member or a commissioner is appointed and approved by the council and the paperwork and the disclosures, there had not been a requirement that those be updated on an annual basis. MDHA is required to, has agreed to do that going forward, as well as beginning to update some of our board policies to make sure that they're crystal clear as it relates to conflicts and recusal, et cetera. Specifically with TIF, and Joe Kane is here who administers that program. The irony is as the attention to TIF and the volume of what MDHA sees from applications, et cetera, as that's been going down, at the same time MDHA has tried to bring some additional clarity and transparency to that, both by posting the application online, being a little more clear about the process. Obviously, thanks to some legislation that you all spearheaded, there's now an annual report that provides a lot of information about just kind of the status of TIF and where every TIF loan is. That was a good requirement to kind of require MDHA to kind of aggregate all that information. And I think going forward, we're going to continue to look to see if there's some other things that we can do that will continue to build kind of transparency and accountability around some of that. One of the things we've talked about is particularly, and maybe some of these will come as recommendations out of this committee, to look at public meetings around some TIF opportunities or specific TIF applications. In and a part of TIF, but also separate from it, look at potentially a citizens advisory committee that reflects all those different constituencies that we serve so that we can get real feedback from what we've done. But the reality is MDHA was set up to be independent. But where I think the opportunity lies with MDHA in terms of trying to instill some confidence and credibility into what we're doing, the one thing that MDHA respectfully knows how to do and does day in and day out is housing for those who are most vulnerable in our community. The opportunity is that is now a foremost priority of any mayor that we have in Nashville and any council, and for the foreseeable future. And so what I'm hoping that we can do over a period of time, including with this committee, is begin to kind of reset some of those relationships, reset some of those expectations, and do all we can to kind of build back in as much credibility and accountability, but also access. So with that, I think where Brian and I discussed this is kind of, as I talked about TIF, let him kind of talk through some process opportunities that he has seen in Austin and some other places.
Stop your question.
Yes, please.
Please. I just wanted to say that Joe and I have been having meetings regularly recently, and I just want to thank him publicly for those meetings. I've never seen that level of cooperation and everything with finance since I've been finance director. So it's been terrific, and we appreciate him coming over and working with us.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
The only thing I want to comment on is, while we have mentioned public perceptions, whether they are real or not, one of the pervasive public perceptions is that there is a fundamental tension between the two objectives of MDHA, that being development and the other providing affordable housing to the populations you just described. And while I heard you say very, very clearly that the priority is to provide housing, that is not perceived to be the reality. So overcoming that is going to be a major part of whatever MDHA does moving forward.
Yes,
and I think some of the methodologies, it's really about building trust and building an expectation that it doesn't exist to serve development first and foremost, and that short shrift was given to affordable housing. What are some of the things that are going to happen? I heard everything you said, but what are some more dramatic, some more readily apparent things that will be happening to change that public perception? Rightly or wrongly, it's there, and I don't think anybody can deny it.
So I want to make sure that I don't preempt the work of this committee, because
Sure.
I hope that's where this committee is headed. But let me give you a couple of examples that I've thought about just in the last couple of weeks while we've been here. The first is just the education and the open dialogue of this, because I think we all, myself included, I think there were a lot of misunderstandings, both about the process, how it worked, what TIF was used for, what it wasn't used for, where it was used, et cetera. I hear from people all the time who, the 12 people who've watched our videos on YouTube, but people who've been here and left, they said, I had no idea, right? That's not the way I thought this worked. Two, we've heard it as we're sitting here, as you begin to kind of rethink TIF, the more kind of acute focus around infrastructure. I mean, that's the equalizer, and that's the equalizer between one site and another site. It's the equalizer between other parts of the community. And then third, I mean, the one thing that I can't let go from where we had from 2 meetings ago was what we learned when we were sitting here, which I don't think had ever dawned on me. What I heard, the reason it's hard to use TIF for smaller projects, which at the same time means in areas like other areas in other redevelopment districts where it's not been widely used, is because your cost of borrowing or your cost of issuance, for the most part, if you go hire Richard Warren, it's going to cost you the same amount on a $5 million TIF loan as it does a $500,000 TIF loan. And by nature, typically those who are trying to get a smaller TIF loan have the inability to guarantee that, and I think that's been, frankly, one of the eye-opening things that a lot of people have learned through this, is that TIF is not just a giveaway, right? I mean, it is on the increment, but the developer does guarantee it. Now, I mean, obviously, you've got the collateral of the income of the increment and the property tax, but I think it's incumbent not just on MDHA, but a broader conversation and coalition to say, how can we help on the cost of borrowing piece, and potentially how can you help offset the guarantee piece to allow it to be used on another project? There are other obstacles to that. So, Paulette, I appreciate the questions, and again, am not immune to the perception issue. Having been on the board now for 3 years, I do have an appreciation and see firsthand really what they do all day, every day. And despite the perception of it, TIF is a really small part of it, but it does impact the overall perception of it. And it was set up to be separate. It was set up to be independent, but I think the way you bridge that now is to really begin to align our interest, right? And to align our interest not just with NOAA, but with the council, with the mayor's office, and with other constituencies out there where we're not there yet. But my hope would be for any one of these three guys that sat here, or for somebody else that's looking to do something around affordable housing in the city, to pick up the phone and call Joe Kane and say, hey, I'm guessing MDHA may not have a tool for this, but let me lay out the project, because you all are in this business, you see it all day, every day, and I just want to use MDHA as a sounding board, right? I want to understand what am I missing here? What could I be doing different? You see, but we're not there yet. I mean, you hear that from some folks, but for us to be a resource in town for nonprofit and for-profit developers, even if they're not coming from TIF, or even if they're not coming for a pilot, but because that's what we do day in and day out, and to be recognized for that. But we've got a lot of work to do to get there, but there is a big perception issue.
Go ahead.
I just, when we've got, I'm hoping that everybody that's here is listening.
I would like to speak. I would like to know why we went through his whole actual proposal about Austin and all this information very quickly.
So this is a meeting of the committee, and we're going to have a meeting on March 6th where we're going to get public comment. But today we're just going to have the committee discussing. So we do appreciate you being here, and we're going to have a public meeting on March 6th.
But we're not through with this.
We haven't
gotten to that yet.
So March 6th, 6:30, council chamber.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Public perception.
So
Was that responsive?
Yes, thank you very much, I appreciate it.
the only thing I would, like, all that's great. I think we're gonna, when we get to the next phase, the next meeting we're gonna have is brainstorming, and we're gonna have a lot more of this. The thing I would like to layer in with this, and I don't think it's inconsistent, is a lot of, I think we heard that over the last X number of years, there's maybe one or two walk-ins to MDHA that ended up with TIF loans. Most everybody has flowed through the mayor's office, and somehow either figuring out a pool of money that's going to be available and a more open to everybody process that goes hand in hand with the idea of trying to work on the transaction costs so it's available to more people. Address, because I think that's part of the perception issue too, is the how you actually get into a loan and whether you can walk in off the street and get one.
And just one more on that, because I think that's really important. Somewhere there's an outreach and education would be really, I think, a great way to work with neighborhood groups, just something where you're out there going, if you've got if you've got an interest in doing these kind of projects, come to a meeting. We're going to do this once a quarter. We're going to do one in here, one here, one here.
Workshops.
Until people stop coming.
So back to you guys.
I already tried to hand it to you.
I'm sorry.
So I'm getting ready to widen the lens here all the way to Texas. So if there are other questions or comments about MDHA specifically,
should probably
Brian's
do that
having
now.
to answer those.
Okay, so let me preface this, and I'm going to go over this really quickly because I don't intend it for everybody to read through all these things, all this material is posted online for those who are who are interested in going through it. Let me preface my comments by saying most of my experience in this area is in a different state. It is in Texas. That has different rules applied to TIF and every other part of the economic development incentive process. What works in one city may or may not work in another city for a variety of reasons. But the reason why I stuck my hand up and wanted to be on this committee, I'm interested in the entire scope of it. But my real passion here is the provision of information and how that can improve the quality of a policy debate. Right? Policymakers can debate whether or not something should be done. But we shouldn't be satisfied in circumstances where there is a dearth of good, reliable information in order to have an informed debate about it. And we hear this a lot when it comes to TIF and other tools, which is, quote, this deal won't pay for itself. You hear different iterations of that statement, and I think part of what's driving that is a lack of good, objective information. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the process that we put in place in Austin, where I spent the majority of the last 15 years before moving here to Nashville. And just to set this up in a way to give you some context, mid 2000s, and this is going to widen the lens here a little bit to talking about economic development in general, but I'm going to try to keep it narrowly focused to conform to our scope here. But I have to kind of widen it a little bit. In the mid 2000s, we got into a debate in Austin about how you incentivize economic development, and the debate it went along these lines. Most incentives that were offered for economic development are what we would refer to as firm-based. It is, a particular company is looking to relocate or expand, and you want to do something to subsidize that particular company. Another way to think about economic development incentives is to look at project-based incentives, and this is where I think TIF falls most closely. In Austin in the mid-2000s, most of incentive deals, and again, like Nashville, we didn't do 15 a year. I mean, on average, you're talking about 2 incentive deals a year. Up to about 03 or 04, all incentive deals were firm-based. And then there was a very high-profile project-based incentive given at the time, really was Austin's first kind of large-scale, what we used to refer to as sort of new urbanist development. There was a lot of consternation, a lot of debate about whether or not that was a good idea. And so leading up to 07, 08, one of the city council members in Austin formed a task force to take a look at the city's policy and how we could improve the provision of information. I was one of the subject matter experts on that task force, mostly focused on cost-benefit analysis and how you could provide information to inform the debate. So what I've got, sure,
How
go ahead.
large is the city council in Austin?
Well, so at the time it was 7. It's since gone to single-member districts, so it's 14 now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would that be one of the recommendations?
Keep going, Brian.
So what I've got here is I've posted the economic development policy for the city of Austin. And one of the chapters here is a process built on safeguarding Austin's resources. And so I just want to walk you through the process for developing information in advance of a project or an agreement being considered by the city council there. Talia.
Was this a recommendation, or is this what they did?
This is what they did.
Okay.
Yeah.
That can differ sometimes.
Yes. So before an agreement got to city council, there was a lot of information collected from in that case, the company, right? Since most of these were firm-based. I've got in here, and I'll show you guys this here in a minute, an example copy of the business information form, which was all the project information. You know, what's the company, what are they doing, you know, how many jobs are being added, where are you locating, what is your expected utility usage, how many, and you know, again, this has come up here in Nashville. How many people do you expect to hire locally versus people who are going to come into the city? And you know, what does that mean for increased demand on city services? So all that information was collected from the company before anything ever made it to council. We then conducted a fiscal impact analysis, or a cost-benefit analysis, to look at the benefits and the costs of that particular proposal. And I'll show you guys an example of the output of that analysis as well. It wasn't really hard to put in place. It's just a little bit of a different way of thinking about economic development. Traditionally, for economic development, if you look at, you know, quote, economic impact study, it's kind of your standard treatment of, you know, here are the direct impacts of 100 new jobs, here are the indirect impacts of, you know, the additional economic spin-off activity from those jobs, and here's what we think the induced effects would be in terms of people making more money and spending it in the economy, and that circulating, right? Well, none of that really gets to what this criticism is of growth not paying for itself, because what I think that means is the public sector expenditure side of the ledger, right? So we'll take something easy. So 100 new jobs, let's say 50% of those jobs are going to be filled by families moving to the city. Well, some portion of those families are going to have children that are going to be added to schools. So what is that cost associated with the benefit of having that project come to the city, right? So it's just a different way of thinking about how we allocate expected costs and benefits for projects. And again, I'll show you guys sort of an example of the output here in a second. We would conduct that analysis. That information would be posted online, much like we're doing with this committee, in advance of the meeting, and then there would be 2 public meetings. There'd be a hearing dedicated to people who wanted to come and comment on the project itself, or make some kind of comment about the analysis. And then at a second meeting, it would be taken up by City Council for action. So you would have, you know, a period of time where all of the information was online. There would then be, you know, 2 opportunities to speak publicly about the merits of that particular project. In terms of the experience and kind of looking back at this now, 10 years later, you know, at the time, and other people I think who participate in this process may or may not agree with what I'm getting ready to say, but at the time, you know, there was lots of hand-wringing. This is going to kill economic development in Austin. Nobody's ever going to approach the city to do a project anymore. We're going to scare everybody off. And you didn't really see much of that in the end. It was a change in the culture, and it took a little while for people to get comfortable providing this kind of information. And again, state laws are what they are in Texas, and they're going to differ here in Tennessee in terms of what information can be put out there for public review about a project. So you got to take that into consideration. But to me, at least, it really improved the debate by having that analysis available on the front end, because then you could argue about whether or not it was a good idea. You could argue about whether or not the city should do it, but you couldn't argue about the facts anymore, because the facts, we had a shared set of facts out there, and so to me at least, that vastly improved the community conversation about. Now, people can choose to ignore facts, but at least we were doing everything we could to make them available before we got into the policy debate.
That says performance-based. What does that mean?
So
I'm assuming that's not
in Austin. Well, no, it is financial. So in Austin, incentives, there are no, for Chapter 380 agreements, which are mostly sales tax rebates. Again, this is getting a little off topic. It's reimbursable, right? So it's not provided on the front end. It's provided on the back end after you've proven that you've met the commitment to the project.
What was the experience in Austin before this process was put in place? Was there a perception that there were too many deals being done and they were too opaque?
So that's a general, I think, kind of misunderstanding when it comes to economic development. People think that, you know, A, your city's doing 20 of these a year or 30 of these a year, which is just not the case in most places. B, that, you know, the city or mayor's office, or however you want to characterize it, does every single deal that's brought to them, which I think, you know, we've discovered through this committee that is simply not true. You know, and anybody in Austin would tell you that they turn away probably more proposals than they ever moved even to this stage, right? So I mean, there's I think a lot of misperception around that.
So you said people might disagree about what to think about it 10 years later. What's the worst a person would say about it?
So the worst somebody would say is, you know, we have a set of peer cities that we're competing with for projects. None of those other cities have these kinds of requirements, and we make them jump through hoops. If we do that, then, you know, it's going to be bad for business in Austin. I have not been privy to every single deal that was done there, so that could be true in some cases. But by and large, I think most reasonable people would agree that this did nothing to hurt the process.
Google just announced how many jobs went to
They're taking over an entire building in downtown Austin.
Well, and on economic metrics, Austin continues to outperform Nashville in most everything.
But I mean, depends if you. Yes. Assuming that outperform means growing at a much faster rate. If you consider that outperforming, then yes,
So-
it is.
Except for like culture and coolness factor. We're not talking about that.
That was a horrible question. Thank you for your clarification.
So you like to withdraw your question?
Yeah.
So two other things, and just to kind of put a point on this, right? So, you know, this is a list of the companies that at the time of this presentation, I think this was the 2014 annual report. You know, if kind of a traditional, you know, illustration of investment and jobs, right? But look at the fourth column over. You know, the city's net benefit. You know, right now, you know, when I got involved in this committee, I started looking through some of the information on TIF here, and we talk about foregone tax revenue. We get into the weeds on a lot of that stuff, but what we haven't talked so much about is if you actually perform the cost-benefit analysis on these projects, would they be in the black? Would they be in the red? Right? I mean, what is the net benefit to the city for doing TIF? And you know, I think that's kind of an open-ended question out there, and I think sort of speaks to the need for more information about both, you know, the benefits and the costs of any kind of economic development project.
A lot of disagreement about how you go about calculating that
Sure.
benefit.
So let me get to
Before you go on,
yeah.
Did that say $4 billion for Samsung?
Samsung, yeah.
Whose investment was that? The city's?
No. That's the investment on behalf of Samsung.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the one column you don't have is what the city's incentive was, but that's baked into your third column, which is net of that, right?
So all of these deals in Austin are now on the open data portal. So, and I didn't put that link in here, I could, but it's easy to find. You go to the city's open data portal, they've got all the information, including every part of the incentive. And honestly, a lot of the information that is posted in Austin is posted here. There's a spreadsheet on Nashville.gov right now showing a lot of that same information for each economic development agreement.
All right, thanks.
So that
Where is that?
where's
I'll ask later. I'd love
We
to.
can send the link over.
yeah.
Can you? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure when.
It's on Matt's site.
Diving into
So,
y'all's
well,
website is not the easiest thing to do.
can we get something with that link into the
Sure.
SharePoint?
Absolutely. So just real quickly, and I'm not going to go through this, just it's up there, you can look at it. Here's an example of a completed business information form. This is for the Athena Health project, and you know, you can scroll through this, and you know, I mean, it's a fairly detailed capturing of, you know, estimates, right? Because this is before a project happens, right? Of what the different activities going to demand in terms of city services, information about the job distribution, utility usage, you know, a lot of everything you would need to do a cost-benefit analysis for a project. And then the last thing I wanted to show you, and I'm really not going to ask you to read this since it's so small. So This is a simplified presentation of the output of the cost-benefit analysis. And the idea here, it's no different than any other kind of fiscal impact analysis you would do. In very simple terms, you are trying to break down the cost of government per household and estimate what we think the marginal costs on the city are for a project. So you can see kind of the different ways so just imagine divvying up Metro's budget and trying to kind of do that on a per household basis, and then talk about, what the likely impacts of a project would be.
So
Right.
let me ask about that. Richard raised the question that if you try to, I've dipped my toes into it only, trying to Google the academic debate on different economic modeling methods, and I know there's off-the-shelf products that I think Metro's economic development people use and the state uses. Is this using an off-the-shelf product, or was this, like what you just said, drilling into the budget to figure out a per capita number?
So you could do that anyway. You wouldn't need any kind of special software to go through that exercise. But the particular tool we used there, which is still available, is something called Web Loci. It was developed by academics at Georgia Tech. It's a very simple, you could do the same work with a spreadsheet, but what I liked about that was that it was a pretty solid defense against what people would refer to as a black box model, right? Because it's developed by academics, so you can get in there and tweak assumptions. So, I'll give you an easy example. In some models, you wouldn't really be able to tweak the discount rate to do the cost benefit. In this, it's easy to do, and it's a very transparent tool that anybody, I think with even a minor amount of training in that area could use and understand. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say, and just the point being, none of this is rocket science. I think with fairly minimal investment and time paid to this, we could figure out a solution. Maybe it's not this, maybe it's something else, right? That makes more sense for Nashville, but we could set something up that at least provides better information for people to argue about, which I think is really the goal, at least for me.
Can we hear from MDHA? You guys are doing something in your analysis, so I'd just like to hear something. What is that something?
One Joe, this is our first step in being fully transparent.
One thing that I've noticed about this, and I'm not going to delve into it a whole lot in here, I believe this is set up much more like an IDB type of project. You have a specific project coming in, they're asking for a specific amount of incentives, and they're going to go do what they're going to do. Redevelopment districts have never been set up with that. The goal of a redevelopment district is a district-wide goal. The old ones dealt with blight. We've had a discussion about blight on them. But even you move on, you have these other goals of what you want to do, and those goals often are not as definitive as what is going to be the benefit. It's like, what is the benefit of bringing affordable housing to Nashville? And how do you cost that? Well,
They're not as quantifiable.
It's not quantifiable, because if I can bring affordable housing in here, then I can bring these people who are going to have these jobs in here. And so it goes back to what are the matrix that you want to guide off of. And traditionally, redevelopment districts have those larger size goals, and that's what they're looking at. What's the benefit of getting a public open space in on the project that we're building up at Rolling Mill Hill? You can't put dollars and cents to that. In theory, I guess you could. Okay, the city government's got to go buy a vacant piece of dirt. They got to turn it into grass. They got to maintain it and everything else. You could put a dollar and cents to that, but it becomes almost a...
There are these intangibles, if you will, in terms of quality of life issues. I think that would surface, it may reduce crime in an area.
And that's what goes into the overall plan that we have with the community input, is what are the goals of the plan, and then that's what you're trying to weigh on the backside, is what were that. You can obviously drill down on the dollars and cents. Okay, this is how much you came, this is how much you generated, and you come up with this, but it's that greater, what is the announcement of Amazon coming into Nashville? What's going to be the overflow benefit of that? And that's that truly gets into the academia of saying, okay, well, it's going to bring in these jobs, these jobs. I mean, that's like what, General Motors brings the Saturn plant.
I'm just going to mention one thing and then ask you your question, and then Bert. So you just made the point that the goals for a redevelopment district are in the redevelopment plan, and I think one of the tensions I would like to deal with somehow is that we all understand now why a redevelopment plan is 30 years. That has everything to do with the loan length and making sure you could ever get a loan so it can be paid back, but there can't be any conceivable way where the goals are good for 30 years. And so we act like there's a redevelopment district that got created in 1980, and we're still more or less using the same goals. And I guess I shouldn't say no conceivable way. I would argue that the goals probably have changed, or should have changed, or should have been reconsidered. And that's not a criticism. I think it's just a tension that I think we could address.
That's something that we have attempted to do with coming up with what are our projects that we want to incentivize at this point in time, and trying to relook at those on a regular basis, which is no different from what y'all are debating here, is what should be out of that goals, which ones deserve some financial input and which ones don't.
So I'm going to ask Brian a quick question, then Bert, then Richard. I've heard you say a bunch of times, and I think I've seen in these materials you posted that you skipped to the measuring, but there was goal setting in Austin at the front end?
There was. But again, this was about economic development in general.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of probably a broader lens than just TIF. But the principles should be the same, right?
Right.
I mean, we should know, and I've said this in previous meetings here, I mean, we should know what we're trying to achieve through any kind of subsidy program.
Right.
And I don't know who would argue with that, really.
Bert?
Yeah, a couple of different kind of questions. One, did it change the debate on incentives having these facts out here, or did people quit arguing about it, or?
Well, it's Austin, sort of the center of navel gazing and argument in the universe, I would suggest. So no, it did not end the argument, but it improved the quality of the argument for sure. I mean, people are still going to ignore facts, but it was really hard for people to stand up in council chambers and say, you're hiding all the information. I don't believe this. And so that was a tough argument to make when you've got it all publicly available and you can believe it or not.
Allow public comment.
Sir, please, we're having a public comment session on March 6th. I would really appreciate if you'd let the committee do its work. Richard? Oh, I'm sorry. Bert, go ahead.
And that is one of the interesting things that Joe was talking about is a more project-based, and you said that there were a couple of these that you did on, that what caused it was a project-based TIF. Is there a methodology for a project-based?
So that gets a little trickier. You can use the same methodology. The analysis technique is no different. But I think this is worth spending a second on. One of the ways I think the city kind of overreacted in Austin was they said no more project-based incentives. We will only now do firm-based incentives. Fast forward 7 years, and the city starts to get really interested in equity and things like food deserts. And when you start talking about, say, well, is there a way we could use city tools to maybe subsidize the existence of a neighborhood grocery store in an area that it won't pencil, right? Now they're looking back and saying, man, I really wish we didn't say we couldn't do project-based incentives anymore, because guess what? A grocery store is a retail operation as part of a project. And so now they're in this quandary right now about what to do there, and so I'm guessing they'll probably be having this debate again.
Richard?
I'll just make a couple of points to the point about the goals of the district's not changing. And I think Joe's right, and a good example, Sobro's in a redevelopment district. After you built the convention center, all of a sudden it's very important to have hotels. And so you started seeing incentives going to hotels, which I think was consistent with the overall goal that they were trying to accomplish in that redevelopment district, to kind of create a lot of economic activity. But until you had a convention center, you probably weren't going to go incentivize hotels. After you built a convention center, it just made sense for the city to protect its investment by trying to incentivize some
So
hotels.
I'm going to pick it at,
Sure.
it made sense for the city, but the city wasn't making the decision. MDHA was making the decision, right?
Well, the city delegated the decision to MDHA, I think in part because we have a 40-person council, and there, I think there's this tension here between are you depoliticizing it or are you making it more political? But either one, you run the risk. I mean, you've got to do the kind of work we're doing right now to say how do we preserve the transparency and help people understand how these decisions get made, whether it's made at the council level or at the MDHA level. I mean, I could argue either one could work.
The main one in that was Omni, which obviously there was a TIF component, but it did come through council. I mean, the council didn't approve the TIF component, but it was widely known and understood. Weston would be the other one where there was TIF on the hotel that had nothing about that would have come through council.
They were, all of those hotels were tied into the Convention Center Authority with room block agreements, so that they were convention center quality hotels, and they were tying into the overall, let's get the convention center full, booked, and paying for itself. And these hotel rooms with the meeting space and everything else were required.
The other point that I want to make is I see how helpful the analysis that Brian went through is to try and do a cost-benefit analysis, but particularly with these redevelopment districts. If you look at an area like the Gulch, I think one way you could look at it after the fact is to say, what are the total dollars the city put into this project? I mean, what did Public Works spend redoing roads? What TIF money did they give that went for infrastructure? What are the total dollars that went in there? And what has been the increase in the tax base down there? I mean, you do an analysis like that, and you say, that was a really good decision. And on the front end, it's very hard to look at that. That could have been a total failure. You know, you could have spent a bunch of money on infrastructure, and no developer can figure out how to make a project work down there. You just spend a bunch of money on infrastructure. It's going to waste. But that's not what happened. So it's hard. I don't want us to get so narrowly focused on trying to have a formula that you can plug something into that ignores what's going on in the larger.
Right, and that wasn't the intent here. And the other important difference here is we're talking about smaller projects with pro formas. Right. I mean, we're not talking about Samsung, right? And so to what to $4 million. Right. So I mean, what would make sense for TIF and looking at doing some kind of objective analysis like this for a project of that scale, knowing that, you know, these are private developments and, you know, given the differences in laws here versus maybe where I have experience doing this, you may not be able to disclose the same kind of information.
Go ahead.
But I see with Joe, I mean, while that is harder on TIF, given the kind of the intangibles, but on the pilot deals that we look at, I mean, we're not looking at economic impact. But I assume there is a little more of a matrix involved with that where we do have a goal that we're trying to
Absolutely.
achieve.
I mean, the financials are considered in all of these, where the project is, what the projected rents are going to be. LIHTCs are great examples because you know what those rent increases are going to be. I mean, this stuff is pro-formed out in such a manner with the increases and everything else going in that you can really lock it down with that. Some of these others that you get into, you know, the more further you get tied to a non-restricted project, you don't know. I mean, no one could have guessed that hotel rooms in Nashville were going to be at $350 a night, and that the occupancy levels are going to be at 90%. You can't pro forma that. And what did that have at the end of the day? Scenario impact back. But would that project have gotten built on day one? And those are the things that everybody can second guess in hindsight, is saying, should we have invested in that? Well, you also have to ask the same question, what would have happened if we had not invested in that? And so those are the far-reaching questions, and that's why we need to have dialogues like this and bring everybody in so they understand on the front end. So, like I said, looking back, you know, Sobro 10 years ago was vacant parking lots. AVB wasn't there.
I think all of this is very helpful, and I don't think second guessing is very productive. But I think it is a very legitimate question to raise in terms of when is enough enough, and what are the broader, what is the context in which it is occurring, the utilization is occurring. So without any kind of a comprehensive plan that we want Nashville to look like X, it seems very much to be whatever the developers are going to bring forward and that somebody will agree to, and then it has happened that it has been beneficial. And to me, that's not the way you make policy, nor is that the way to kind of have growth that is inclusive and equitable and minimizes a lot of the tensions that we currently are experiencing.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that's where we need to hear from this as to what the need is. The example right here of the grocery store in the food desert is the prime example, and you still need one. We need one over in East Nashville, and in the East Bank redevelopment district area. I mean, there's still need for some grocery stores and some of these other things in there. So do you now take away the entire redevelopment district, even though there are still some needs for some other things to take place in there? Or do you have these conversations and have the focus of saying, this is what we need to focus on?
And I think too, I think that marries with what a theme you've had, which is, do we have the opportunity to recalibrate more often than once every 30 years?
That's exactly.
I think we would all say, I mean, there's a way to do that, because 5 years from now, and that's my concern about all this, that we do something today that takes away a tool that we may want 10 or 15 or 20, just like Austin, right, where they can't do project-based. But do we have the opportunity to look out 5 years and in 5 years say, hey, that's been the focus and that has worked, but now the focus is housing or infrastructure or food deserts or this area instead of that area. And I think, if we could figure out how for that to happen formally or informal, I don't know what the state law would permit us to do, but I think if you could figure out how to build that in, that would be a relief for MDHA, right? I mean, it's hard for us to get locked in for 30 years as well.
And again, from a developer's perspective, I mean, if you're not going to incentivize this, but this is something that you want to go make happen, well, great.
Yeah.
It's a real help to be able to say, okay, if I've got this and these are the economics, I can go deliver something that really works.
I think I totally agree with that. Like developers that I know and the ones we've heard talk, one of the top 2 or 3 comments is just tell me what the dang rules are, and then so I can rely on them, and then I can maneuver. The recalibrating also helps with the concern that Talia has brought up of wanting to know on a 2, 3, 4, 5-year time horizon what's the spend, what's the city's spend on it, what's the investment. We're sort of drifting off transparency into our next meeting.
This is great. To me, this is great to be able to see what it looks like.
Yeah. Have you guys?
Sorry to solve the incentive debate though.
I do like, having been a participant in conversations where on the council floor where people talk about, well, I don't know this and I don't know that and I don't know the third thing. Having something to, and some of it is valid. Some of it is it's sitting in the person's inbox, but at least that would be great to take that off the table. You guys got more? All right. Thank you very much.
Pulled up the syllabus you want to talk about.
Oh, yeah, great.
Next.
Yeah. So 2 meetings from now, March 6th, public comment, Metro Council Chamber. That is a little under a month away, and I am going to get something, one pager out into the universe, and I'm going to release it to every advocate organization that I can think of on any side of the spectrum remotely related to housing, and try to get Metro's, the executive branch's communication channels talking about it. And so I think...
And I was also going to try to let places like ULI and others know, so that we're kind of covering the full spectrum of that.
Anybody who's got an idea about where it should be, don't get that into me, because I do want to hit, business interests, community, and like, I don't even want to care, like everybody's interest. And I think I'm the ground rules for it. There's got to be some time limit. It's not going to be Q&A. We're there to hear what people have to say. And, you know, council meetings like that, it's either 2 or 3 minutes. And I don't know if one number or the other grabs your attention. Or do you guys just...
I thought council was 2.
I think it's
Most
3.
of it, oh, it is? Okay, because most of the things I've been to,
I think it's
you have
3.
to narrow it down to 2.
I think it's when we do public hearing on zoning stuff, it's 3. There have been meetings like this that have been one-off where we have shortened it. My personal opinion is that 2, almost everybody ends up hurrying, and I'd rather avoid that, even though it means, you know, obviously 3 minutes instead of 2 can add up, but I would rather do 3. But
That's fine.
I mean, can they submit written things also? Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, I think, first of all, they've got the email link that they can get us information whenever they want. But I think if people want to deliver something to us, we'll take it. Okay. And then we can get everybody's submissions online, if there are any. So I'm gonna make that get rounded out for March 6th. And then on February 22nd, we're gonna, I guess, have more of this conversation we started today. I've promised a couple times, and like Richard's minutes, I haven't quite got there to get my working list of ideas, but
What are you going to do, Bob?
I will get that done by a week from today, so y'all can see that a week before on the 22nd. And I will come up with some way to, you know, segment the conversation, so it's not just, what do y'all think?
Have you thought about what the process of writing the report will be?
Process for what? I'm sorry.
Of writing the report?
Oh, yeah,
Our minute writers.
I have thought about it, and I'm not excited by it. I have thought that we're all busy, and we need this to both be thorough but not become a full-time job to write the report. So we have an enormous set of materials online, so I'm thinking there ought to be some section that doesn't seek to characterize everything we've talked about, but more list the topics and refer people to the SharePoint, because between the minutes and the materials, that says everything better than we could characterize it in 5 or 10 pages or 20 pages even. And then I'm thinking that we're probably going to have categories of recommendations. I'm thinking there's going to be some recommendations, a lot of recommendations that we all agree on, and then we're going to want to talk about whether if there's ideas that have got traction among us but not unanimous, whether we want to have a separate reference of, you know, requires further discussion.
Second opinion.
Yeah, and there's going to be, I'm thinking there's going to be some things that are immediate action, and then there's things that we might want to recommend further work. Like I think the whole idea of whether IDB could be used on a parcel-by-parcel basis is interesting, but as to my knowledge, the IDB's done one TIF deal ever. It's Bellevue. They've got no staff, no Joe Kane, and so there's a whole, if we want to do that, it might be a great idea, but there would have to be a whole mechanism stood up to make that doable. And that's nothing I think we'd be in a position to recommend immediate action on. I don't know, that's as far as I've gotten.
I just didn't know whether after we came up with those categories, whether we were going to assign different people to do a first draft of something and circulate it, or is that?
I hope so.
Okay. Because we can't really, a committee can't write a report. You know, I mean, we've got to like have individual input.
Yeah, we're going to have to hash that out next time, I think. Paulette?
I was just going to say that I think it's important to have all the information that's on SharePoint. I don't know how many people have been availing themselves of it. And I think that the fact that, you know, it's on Channel 3, if people want to look at it. But I do think somewhere we need to have some kind of summary statement or diagram of something about how TIF works now, so that there is a common baseline from which everything else springs. I just feel rather strongly about that, and I'm not sure how to make it happen, but because these misperceptions are going to inform what people say and do and think, and they're misperceptions, and I think, you know, all reasonable people could agree that they are misperceptions. So if everybody knows how it operates, and, you know, they still might not believe it, but at least there's evidence to prove, empirical evidence to show that this is the case, that might be helpful. Just a thought.
So I like that idea. We've talked about that a little bit before. The thing that comes to mind is the Metro Human Relations Commission has a piece they did on like the basics of affordable housing that is put together the way most of us in society consume information now, a combination of infographics but it works. And it's successful. You know, we would have to lean on some executive branch skill set and person power to make that come together.
And that was to my question also. It just, who wrote the report that you were just like that last one?
There were subcommittees, 3 subcommittees. Each one came up with their own report, and
Bob wrote ours. Because when you have stuff like this, you can't have 10 different variations and then expect somebody to bring them together. And so he, as the chair, really took on a lot of responsibility and incorporated it. I mean, we reacted and responded and could, but I mean, there was one person ultimately who wrote it.
And then so each of the subcommittee reports was added as an addendum, and then the first 10, 15 pages was written by, prepared by Adrian Harris in the mayor's office, with the input from Mr. Purcell and Brenda Wynn.
And everybody read it, signed off on it before it was released. I mean, I don't know where the resources are, but it, you know, the thought of me writing 10 pages of anything, I mean, I just kind of cringe at the thought of it.
Because Adrian Harris's and her resources, it ended up being, I mean, could you go back to that? You'll be able to see visually where the mayor's office work stops and my work starts. Like, that's pretty, and just for people who are, okay.
There we go.
That's, I'm not sure. I think it was, well, anyway, it starts being, you know, and then when you get to the subcommittee reports, and a little bit further, that's obviously professionally put together. That Adrian put together.
Oh, yeah, there are 40 pages of backup.
And then that's what I wrote, and I've got links in there, which is as clever as I could get, but it's, you know, like I'm using Microsoft Word's outline format, and there's nothing really terribly pretty or engaging about it.
I would ask, you know, the different agencies that are here and whatever, just to, if they can help us, just help us execute it, would be a really big help.
I'll have some conversations with the mayor's office between now and our next meeting about that.
Wonderful.
Budget season.
You got about 10 or 20.
Budgets are due
10 or 20,
today.
yeah.
Yes.
All right.
They are due today.
As we close in on 3, Brian, do we have any comments?
No emails came in this time.
All right. I don't think there's any new business, is there?
I just want to, so David Williams passed away, and what an advocate. I mean, it just hit, and I just can't imagine the city without him.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that.
He was getting ready, just for this, he was getting ready to co-chair through Nashville's agenda on affordable housing kind of initiative for them that we had a kickoff call about this morning.
Yeah, it's just devastating.
Well, that's really brings a crowd down.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
What a man.
Yeah. Okay, well, our next meeting is back here on February 22, and I think we're going to decide that up till now has been the easy part, and now we get down to business.
I think it's been very helpful. I mean, I've learned a lot.
Yeah, I feel like I have too. I appreciate everybody. Thanks.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.